Hi, and welcome to this video on life and death on the Mesa Verde. The Mesa Verde is best known for the iconic cliff dwellings, but in this video we're going to talk about a range of topics: the geography, the people, the history, the use of resources, because this ties together a whole range of factors. Now, the Mesa Verde is best known for these cliff dwellings, but there's actually been people living on the Mesa Verde for thousands of years. It's located in Colorado in America, and it's the centerpiece of a national park, and it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Now, the people who lived there are often referred to as ancestral Pueblo people, but it's important to note that Pueblo is the Spanish name for them. When Spanish colonizers came into this area, they called the local settlements Pueblo. It's not what the people called themselves. We don't actually know what name the people living on the Mesa Verde called themselves because they're no longer there. We don't have any native people living in that area. There are current tribal groups in the region, groups like the Taos, San Ildefonso, Acomo, Zuni, and Hopi. So the Mesa Verde is often noted for those cliff dwellings, but there are actually over 5,000 archaeological sites, which are covering thousands of years of people living on the mesa. So let's talk about what the Mesa Verde is. A mesa is a flat area that is rising above the ground here. A plateau is if it's a very, very large flat area. Mesa, medium-sized. If we just have a small outcrop like this, it's referred to as a butte or butte. Verde means green in Spanish. So again, we don't have the local people's name for this. We are using the Spanish word for it. And the mesa is made up of sandstone, sedimentary rock, and when we look at it from above, we can really see that geography. We can see that down below we have desert, we have erosion. We can see here that most of the soil and rock here has eroded away, but the mesa is left standing up above the desert. We can see a couple of little outcrops here, the buttes, and it's really obvious in the photograph that the mesa is green. It's a lot greener, there's more plant life than in the desert down below. And that's because of its height. It is in the Goldilocks zone, basically. It is just right for really productive plant growth. Below in the desert, it's too hot. But it's not too tall, like a mountain, where it would be too cold. It is just right to get really productive plant growth, which means that it can support a really large number of animals and therefore a large number of people. But one of the constraining factors is the water. All of the water on the mesa comes from above, either as rain or snow. There's no springs bringing water up from underneath. It is all from above, which means that this is the collection area for that water. The water soaks through the limestone and forms springs in the cliff, which were used by the people in the cliff dwellings, but It's still all coming from above. So what we'll start off by doing is looking at a bit of the history, the people who lived on the mesa at various times. The earliest that we've got evidence for is around 9,500 years BC, which were nomadic people who are called the Clovis culture. They migrated through the area and they were hunters. They were hunting big game. There's a lot of big game still there, but there was even more then because it was before the last big megafauna die-off. We know these people came through here because they left their stone tools. Lots and lots of spear points, knives, scrapers, axes. They didn't leave any buildings. We've got no evidence of that, but what they did was they left stores of tools. Instead of carrying all of their heavy stone tools all the time, they would leave little stashes of them in certain places. And then they could stop there when they were hunting. They could slaughter their game. They could prepare the meat. And they had their tools there. And then they would move on to the next area. Around 2,000 years later, there's a change in the climate. The mesa is warmer, drier, and there's a move from large game to smaller animals. And this was part of the megafauna die-off that had occurred. There are a lot of people coming through the area still, but they were swapping what they were hunting from large game to smaller animals, and they were starting to use the atlatl, a spear thrower, which is basically a lever which gives you more power when you throw a spear by increasing your arm. Your arm is the lever and you are making it longer. So that means you can throw a spear further and with more force. Over the next few thousand years, we see a gradual increase in the number of people moving to the Mesa Verde. We see them starting to live in the caves. We don't have any buildings there yet, but we know they were living in the caves because we get better preservation of organic material. So we start to find things like baskets, woven sandals, mats, these really adorable little twig figurines of animals. We start to find jewelry, and that jewelry particularly shows a lot of trade because it contains beads which are made from lots of different materials. So things like seashells, abalone shells, that's a long way from the coast. The twig figurines may have been as toys, but it's also quite likely that they are depicting the animals that they want to hunt. That it is part of a ritual to go, we want to hunt, we want success, we will make little models of the animals that we want. The next group of people living there is described as the basket maker culture because they made baskets. And big change we see here is we're starting to see farming. As well as hunting, foraging for food, they are starting to farm on the mesa. Having baskets meant they could store things more easily. And the thing that we start to see them farming is mostly corn. Now, the corn was probably more like these primitive variants we can see in the photo here, not like what we see in the shops as modern corn. They were doing what was called dryland farming, which means they're relying on the rain. They're never watering their crops, they're never storing water and using it for watering them later. They rely on what is happening with the weather. We start to see semi-permanent villages, which are very small, usually 1 to 3 buildings, and they're described as pit houses because they are dug down as a pit and then a sloping roof. And there are thousands of these sites on the Mesa, and there are archaeologists who are investigating them. And what they typically see is that you've got a small chamber here, which was like an entry chamber, a larger one here, and we see a lot of holes, which are for things like posts, which could be to support the roof, or for things like drying racks for drying meat or plants. We also start to find burials with grave goods. So we find a range of different things there. Lots of rush sandals, mats, robes, blankets. And then a critical thing is the start of ceramics. Because although you can use a basket for storage, it's not a great cooking pot because it catches on fire. Cooking pots were a big improvement because they lead to new foods. This is a picture where they've chipped away the outer rock layer to expose a paler rock underneath. And we can see a number of the different types of animals that they were probably hunting. So this looks like a deer. Some of these look a bit like a goat. This one looks like a dragon. So I'm not sure about the actual accuracy of their drawings, but it's really cute. Now, those ceramic pots meant that people could start storing beans, dried beans, and then cooking them later. Beans are a great food. They're high in protein, they combine well with corn, but if you have dried beans, they take a long time to cook. You have to soak them and cook them for hours. So, the development of ceramic cooking pots meant that this food group was now much more easily accessible. And that meant you have more food, you could get more people, we get larger villages, larger meeting halls. Other crops they were growing were things like squash and gourds like pumpkins. This photo shows them, but these are the modern varieties because I could not find any photos of the earlier varieties. A key meat source, though, was the domestication of turkeys. So many people were in the area that there weren't any of the wild deer, which had been a big food group before. However, turkeys were there, and they started to domesticate turkeys and use them as their main source of meat. We know this because we find lots of remains of the bones, and there's a whole field where scientists analyze the radioactive isotopes in the bones, and they look at the balance of different isotopes and are able to work out what the turkeys were eating. And what they see is a change from them eating a very mixed diet, which is them foraging. They're wild turkeys. They're eating plants, bugs, caterpillars, insects, all sorts of things. The change is that they start to eat mostly corn, and that is a key sign that they were domesticated, that the people on the mesa were growing corn and using that to feed the turkeys for meat. We also start to see the development of the bow and arrow, which is used for hunting, but typically smaller animals. There's no large animals left on the mesa because there are too many people. They've hunted most of the large animals. We then come to what are referred to as the Pueblo people, remembering this is not what they called themselves. And this is divided into 3 time spans, Pueblo 1, 2, and 3. And what we see is that over a period of several hundred years, we get more and more people on the mesa. This leads to changes in the buildings and in the agriculture. Because you have more people, you need more food. And they were really reliant on corn for food for them and for the turkeys. Now, up to this point, they'd been relying on dry land farming, just rainwater. But this was no longer enough to support this population, so they started managing the water. First thing they did was what are called check dams, which is basically where you have a hill or a slope and the water is running down it, and you build a small wall so the water will collect behind the wall. This was the first step. But as they increased their population, they needed more and more. They started building actual houses under the cliffs. Prior to this, they'd lived in caves there, but now they're building complex buildings. We can see some here. They're several stories high. This gives them shelter from the sun during summer, but because of the angle where they are under the overhanging cliff, they still get sunlight in winter. They're typically several levels high, but we don't find built-in staircases. They were using wooden ladders. And a distinctive feature is that the doorways are described as being shaped like keyholes, wider at the top. And here we can see the same area in summer and in winter, and we can see how protected those cliff houses were. You might notice some of these round structures here. So this is showing us one of those keyhole-shaped doorways. Here we can see those round structures. The actual buildings that people lived in tended to be built around squares. However, these round areas are our meeting rooms. They're called kivas, or supapu is used for this hole here. Supapu is a hole which symbolises the portal between this world and the next. And all of these have a supapu here. We also find a fire pit. We have these built-in seats around the edges here, vents to allow air in to get good airflow for the fire to burn, and so it's not smoky. And they probably had a roof over the top. And these are their community areas. Inside some of the buildings, we see things like wall paintings. And we can see that the pictures are very symbolic, lots of geometrical designs. And we see that in a lot of the other artifacts as well. Here we have a reconstruction of the interior in a museum. So this is what the museum has reconstructed based on the evidence. And we can see a hearth for cooking, we can see cooking pots, we can see baskets, racks here for drying items, and a lot of ceramics coming into use with a lot of geometric designs. Well, I think these ones, you can almost see the shape of the cliff houses in that, can't you? But the constraining factor was always the water. From relying on those small dams they were building to collect water, they started building large reservoirs to catch the water and to store it. And then they would use these to water the crops. We know the crops were watered using pottery vessels because we find the remains of these. They weren't digging trenches for irrigating the crops, they would basically carry the water by hand. And it is by hand, there's no horses or anything that they're using to carry the water. They're carrying it in basically a bucket. The reservoirs have these spiral channels that they're using to direct the water in and that you could walk down when the water level was lower. And then we come to around 1200 AD. And what we see is another climate change. It's colder and drier in that area. So a lot more people moved to the Mesa because it was the best area to live. It was greener. It had that shelter. It had resources. But now we have a much larger population to support. And you've got the same area for crops, and you are relying on that to feed your people and to feed your turkeys to provide meat. And around 50 years later, suddenly this thriving population is gone. Everyone left. They left a lot of their belongings behind, and we're left asking why? Why did they leave? Why did we go from 20,000 people to none? And again, it comes down to the climate. What people did was they looked at the tree rings. Dendrochronology is the science of dating using tree rings. In areas with distinct winter and summer, we get tree rings because we get limited growth during winter and a lot of growth during summer. If we have a poor year for growth, the rings will be very, very close together. If we've got really good conditions, those rings will be further apart. What people did was that they took samples from logs that had been used in the buildings and from the surrounding area, and they built up a timeline which enabled them to see which were good years for growth, which were poor years. So where there were wooden supports in the cliff buildings, they would basically drill a very narrow tube out of them, and that meant that they could look at the tree rings in that log. and they also looked at ones from around the area. And from that, they were able to build up a record of the rainfall over hundreds of years. And what we see is here we've got 1200 AD, that point where we had lots of people there, 20,000 people. And that within the next 50 years, they had all left. And we look at the rainfall and we see that in that 50 years, it's almost always below average, that it is very low. We have more people, less water, and that's going to have an impact on our food production. So this graph is where they are working out what they think the food production was like in those years. And we can see that from 1200 here to 1250 is that it was quite reduced. And that tells us we had more people and they were running out of food. And what happens when we have too many people for the resources? We get starvation, fighting for resources, and we get death either due to starvation, due to disease because people are not healthy, they're not able to fight off the disease, and a migration from the area where people were able to do that. So the Mesa Verde went from being an area that everyone moved to because of resources to somewhere they all left because there were not enough resources to support them. We know that some of this happened because there are things like bodies that had not been formally buried, that had been quickly covered or just left, and that a lot of those bodies showed damage to the skull and arms, which is evidence of violence. They're either being hit on the head or they are putting their arms up to protect themselves from being hit. In a somewhat gross topic, in one pit house they found the remains of 7 bodies. Disarticulated means that they had been cut apart. They had been exposed to fire. And a coprolite is the remains of feces. And what this tells us is that this is actually cannibalism. That they had got so desperate for food that they had cut apart some bodies, cooked them, eaten them, and pooped them out is the coprolite. And this is a sign of cultural collapse, that they were just so desperate for food and for resources. And from around 1250, there was nobody on the Mesa Verde. Nobody lives there now. That group of people are all gone. Some of them moved to the surrounding areas and were incorporated into the local tribes there. But this whole culture, all those people are gone. The Mesa Verde, though, is a World Heritage Site and they have over 500,000 visitors per year. And it's also constantly being studied by archaeologists because we have these thousands of years and these changing cultures living there. And they're going to be looking at that for considerable time in the future. We'll finish up with just a photo showing the cliff houses in the snow because it really shows how sheltered and what a protected area they were in, where even though there's snow above, snow down here, they would have been safe and snug and warm and protected in these cliff dwellings. Thank you. I hope you found that interesting.